Hello and welcome to Principles of Accounting 2. I'm your host, Dr. B. Today we are talking about activity-based costing. Activity-based costing is very similar to what you've learned with process and job costing. The primary difference between activity-based costing and job and process costing is that with activity-based costing, we discuss the process of activities as it relates to cost. Before, in process-based costing, we discussed cost as it relates to the continuous process of manufacturing. And in job-based costing, we discussed the costing as it relates to the production for specific jobs. As it related to job-based costing, we talked about a guitar manufacturer as an example, and that each customer order represented a job that the manufacturer produced the number of units purchased by the customer. That's a job. Process-based costing, process costing, we talked about the example of the ice cream company, like Hershey's or I really like ice cream, by the way, Hershey's or Breyers or whatever. And you know that it's at the grocery store and it's always there. That's because they're a process based manufacturer. Now, what do we mean by process based? Is it's continuous. That's they're processors, right? It's continuous. That's why you continually see that ice cream is on the shelves at the grocery store. So we talked about job-based costing. We talked about process-based costing. Now we're going to talk about this thing called activity-based costing. When it comes to activity-based costing, we take the approach of costing as it relates to individual activities. An activity base could be the activity of doing inspections, which is quality control inspections. That's an activity. An activity from the perspective of assembly. An activity base of certain parts of assembly. Activity base of number of hours driven or something like that. The activity is what the individual employees are doing. That's the activity. And so we identify costs based off of those activities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So here we go. I'm going to slideshow view. There we go. Okay, activity-based costing. Here we are. So as you all know, and you're going to keep hearing it, just like I said in the very first day, we're focusing from a perspective of a manufacturer. To develop a product, we have direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. These are the key costs of a product. We'll call those product costs. Direct materials, as you know, are the bulk of the material cost it needed to create a product. Direct labor are the employees directly touching the units being produced, right? Those are your assembly line workers, right? And then we have factory overhead. Factory overhead is the rent for the space or the mortgage for the space. Factory overhead is also utilities needed for the machines. Factory overhead is also depreciation of the property, the plant, and equipment. Factory overhead are those things that are indirect, right? And we break those down into direct and indirect costs. Direct materials and direct labor we consider to be direct costs. These are costs that make up the majority of the finished good. And indirect costs are costs that we cannot directly trace to that finished good, right? And you all remember this when we talked about job costing and process costing in the past two chapters. So let's talk about factory overhead, and that's what activity-based costing focuses on, is the allocation of factory overhead, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So we have factory overhead costs. And now remember, factory overhead costs include things like indirect materials. Those are materials that we use, but we only use a little bit of, like glue for a guitar. We only use a little bit. We can't really trace that expense directly to the guitar, so it's an indirect cost. We have indirect labor. That would be your supervisor's salaries. We can't trace those directly to the guitar, so therefore supervisors' salaries are considered indirect labor, which is actually part of factory overhead. And then we have the depreciation of machines. We have sandpaper, right, which we use to sand the guitar down. We have the lacquer, which is the stain that goes on the guitar. These are all parts of factory overhead, indirect materials, indirect labor. And then, of course, also in factory overhead, we have the electric that we need to run the machines, right? And so all of that is considered to be factory overhead. Now, we talk about factory overhead from that perspective. We need to understand, how do we assign the cost of factory overhead to the finished good? Now, there's a couple of different methods that we're going to discuss tonight. We're going to focus on activity-based costing, of course, but we need to understand the three primary methods of allocating factory overhead costs. The first one is called the single plant-wide rate method. What this is exactly as it sounds, single plant-wide rate. What we mean by this is we take our total factory overhead costs and simply divide it by the numbers we expect to produce, right? And that creates what we call a single plant-wide rate. And we assign that same rate to all of our produced units to allocate overhead costs. We'll talk more about that in the next few slides. Just want to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about applying factory overhead costs. The second method that is commonly used is called the multiple production department rate method. In this method, I want you to think about a company that makes more than one product line. Okay, and they have multiple departments. So an example of this would be John Deere, maybe. You may know John. You may have never heard the name John Deere. John Deere, they make lawnmowers, okay, but that's not all they make. They also make heavy equipment. They also make snowmobiles. They also make other things, okay? Or think Honda. Honda is another great example. Honda is an auto manufacturer. They're not just an auto manufacturer. They also make lawnmowers. They also make generators. They also make other products. So Honda has a department for their car manufacturing. They have a second department for their snowmobiles. They have a third department for their generators, a fourth department for their batteries, whatever. Right? They make a lot of different things. So that would be multiple production department. That's an example of that. Go ahead, Keandre.
Would Tesla be counted as one as well? Because they don't also just manufacture.
Absolutely.
They do solar panels and all that other.
Yeah, that's it. Yes, most definitely, Keandre. That's a great example. Tesla, they don't just make cars, they also make solar panels, they make batteries for other car manufacturers, and they do a lot of different things.
Oh, yeah, they also have SpaceX.
They also have SpaceX. They also have, there's another company he's got, Hyperloop. They have a Hyperloop company. So yeah, they're involved in a lot of different areas. So to answer your question, yes, that would be a multiple department. Uh, Andre mentioned hardware store. Would hardware store be classified as multiple departments? If the hardware store is making the products that they sell, then yes. If they're not, then no. Good question. Paint. Paint could be its own department, yes. And if the hardware store also makes tools, then yes. So the hardware store is also involved in manufacturing the stuff that it sells. So an example would be Ace Hardware. They manufacture their own paint. They manufacture their own tools. So that could be classified as a multiple production department company, yes. Yeah, good question. So, yeah, that's a good example. There's a lot of other ones as well. Yeah, very good. So with multiple department production rate, the way it works is first you find the direct materials and direct labor for each product line. And when it comes to the factory overhead rate, we separate it by department. It's not going to be the same for each department. It'll be different. That's why it's multiple production. We're going to talk about a lot more about that in the coming slides. And the third allocation method for applying factory overhead is called the activity-based costing method. And what this does is it tells us we use a basis of activity to apply factory overhead rate. An example would be number of machine hours, miles driven, labor amount, a dollar amount, or labor hours. My apologies, labor hours. It's a factor of the activity. That's why we call it activity-based costing. And we'll talk a lot more about that. Good conversation. So the three, again, single plant-wide method, multiple production department method, and activity-based costing method. So what happens is a company will select one of these three methods for allocating their overhead, the manufacturing overhead. Okay, so let's talk about single plant-wide method first. This method is very simple. All we do here is we apply a single rate for everything that the company does. Okay? So here's an example. I love this example, by the way. It's one of my favorites. This company, Ruiz Company. Ruiz Company produces both snowmobiles and riding lawnmowers. So in a year, the company they manufactured 1,000 snowmobiles and 1,000 riding lawnmowers. The company has a total budgeted overhead of $1.6 million and a budgeted labor hours of 20,000 labor hours. So here's the budget below. Here's how it looks. The first thing we do is we identify we call it the particulars, but you could also call it activities. Andre asked, can a company use all three to fine-tune the bottom line? So the short answer is no, you can't use all three at the same time, but you can calculate all three to find out which is the best solution for the company. Good question. So the particulars for this. Yes, go ahead.
I'm saying thank you for clarifying that.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. So the particulars. Planned production for the year. The company plans to manufacture 1,000 snowmobiles and 1,000 riding lawnmowers. We the company has estimated that it'll take 10 hours of labor to produce one single unit. Okay, so that's 10 hours to make one snowmobile, 10 hours to make one riding lawnmower. So therefore, the company has budgeted 10,000 labor hours total for each product that they sell. So 10,000 hours to create 1,000 snowmobiles, 10,000 hours to create 1,000 riding lawnmowers. How do we get 10,000 hours? Simple. You take the number of units times the number of hours per unit. So 1,000 times 10 is 10,000. We add up the two together to get the total budgeted labor hours to get to 20,000 hours that we plan to use. Okay, so using the single plant-wide method, as I said earlier, it's a very simple calculation. So to get the single plant-wide method rate, all we do is we take the total budgeted factory overhead, in our example, 1.6 million, divided by the total budgeted plant-wide allocation, in this case, 20,000 hours. So in the example, 1.6 million divided by 20,000 hours. So the best way to remember the formula for single plant-wide factory overhead is to remember that the top line is your budgeted factory overhead. That'll be given to you. Say, oh, for this coming year, the budgeted factory overhead is 1.6 million. The bottom line is going to be the allocation method, or the allocation. The allocation could be something like number of hours, number of dollars for labor, or machine hours. These are very common units of measure for the allocation. So remember that bottom line is going to be some unit of measure, whether it be hours for machine or labor or labor dollars. So you take your budgeted factory overhead divided by your base. So in our example, our total, what am I trying to say here? Factory overhead budget was 1.6 million. We are estimating that we're going to use 20,000 direct labor hours. So our single plant-wide rate is going to be $80 per hour. $80 per hour. So now you're asking, okay, well, now that we figured out that the single plant-wide method is $80 per hour, what do we do next? Okay, so we take our $80 per hour and we multiply that by the number of hours it takes to create one unit. So as we said earlier in our example, it takes 10 hours to create one snowmobile. It takes 10 hours to create one riding lawnmower. So what we do is we take the $80 per labor hour of overhead and we multiply that by the number of hours it takes to create one unit. So that gives us $800. $800 is the amount of overhead that we would apply per unit. Does it make sense so far?
Kind of, Professor. I'm just letting it set in.
Yes.
Wonderful. Great. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, so $800 per unit of factory overhead. So remember, you have direct labor, direct materials, and factory overhead are the three primary costs to create a single unit. So we already know what our overhead is now. It's $800. The next thing we would do is we would take our direct materials and our direct labor costs, you add those three together to get the total cost. So here's a nice graphical representation of how to find the plant-wide factory overhead rate. So again, you take the 1.6 million, which is the total overhead that's been budgeted. You divide that by the 20,000 direct labor hours that have been budgeted to get to $80 per direct labor hour. You then multiply that by the number of hours it takes to create a single unit, which gets us to, in this example, $800 per unit of overhead. That's just overhead. That doesn't include the direct labor or the direct materials. So why do people use single plant-wide method? It's easy. It's very easy to do. It's a very easy calculation. And it's inexpensive to use that calculation. Absolutely. What are some of the issues with using single plant-wide method? It assumes the consumption of factory overhead are all the same across all products, and we know that's probably not true. Especially there's going to be different costs associated with a lawnmower versus a snowmobile. We know that because different sizes engines, there's a lot different parts that go into each one, so the process is going to be different. But using the single plant-wide method, it ignores that. So that's one of the negative factors of using this method. And the other one is that it may not apply to companies that manufacture multiple products. Okay, any questions on the single plant-wide method before we move on to multiple department? We're good so far? Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, let's jump into the multiple department method. When production departments are significantly different in the manufacturing process, the factory overhead costs are normally incurred differently for each department. For example, if we have a company that manufactures lawnmowers and snowmobiles, we know those two things are significantly different. Okay? So we would treat each line item differently. We would say we have the snowmobile department, we have the riding lawnmower department, or division, or whatever you want to call it. But it's the same concept. So in this case, factory overhead costs may be more accurately allocated using multiple department method. Don't worry, we'll cover the example. I know you're excited about it. I am too. It's a good example. So this multiple production department method uses different rates for production to allocate factory overhead costs to the products. Whereas the one we just talked about, the single plant-wide method, it doesn't do that. It treats all products the same. So here we go. Let's talk about our company, Ruiz Company. We manufacture snowmobiles and riding lawnmowers. Sounds like a nice company, right? So using the single plant-wide method, it's just the one rate. We talked about that. 1.6 million divided by 20,000 labor hours gets us $80 per hour per unit. So $80 times the 10 hours to create one unit is $800. That's the single plant-wide method. Now with the multiple production department method, we have two departments in our example. We have a fabrication department and an assembly department. Okay? We make two different products and we have two different departments. So instead of thinking department by product, think department by process. Department by process. So you have your fabrication department and your assembly department. You probably remember the example we talked about before with the guitars. And you probably remember when we talked about job costing, we discussed the idea of having multiple departments. We have the sawing department, we have the assembly department, we have the packaging department, all that good stuff. The same concept applies. So in our example, we're manufacturing snowmobiles and lawnmowers. We might have two different departments. We got the fabrication department. Fabrication, what that means is they're shaping the metal, right? They're shaping the metal. They're cutting the metal. They're making it into the shape. That's fabrication. Welding, all that fun stuff. And then you have your assembly department. Those are the ones putting together the engines and, putting it onto the body of the frame and all that fun stuff. And those two departments are responsible for creating the products. And so in multiple production department rate, each department has its own rate for overhead. That's the idea behind this. So our example, our great example. I love our example. Okay, here we go. Ruiz Company. Ruiz Company, we have a metal fabrication department. They cut and shape the metal. The assembly department manually puts the pieces together. Remember, we have a annual budget factory overhead of 1.6 million. We need to spread this 1.6 million across our two departments. So we're going to need to allocate our budget to each department. In our example, we allocated $1,030,000 to fabrication and $570,000 to assembly. You might be asking, well, how did they come up with these figures, or what was the logic behind this spread? Well, the fabrication department, we know it takes longer and more effort to create or to shape the metal for these products, more so than the assembly department. So that's the logic behind this allocation for the budget. So how do we come up with this? Well, you have your 1.6 million. We allocated 1,030,000 to fabrication and 570,000 to assembly. Remember, we budgeted 20,000 total direct labor hours for the year. So our company decided we're going to assign 10,000 labor hours to fabrication and 10,000 labor hours to assembly. Using the similar, it's not the same budget, but or the same formula, but it's very similar to the single plant-wide method. For the production department factory method, we take the total factory budget overhead divided by the department allocation. So, what do you mean, Dr. B? How does that look? Okay, so we have our department budget, 1,030,000, divided by 10,000 hours. So 1,030,000 divided by 10,000 hours equals $103 per direct labor hour of overhead that we assign to each unit. So think of the plant-wide method that we talked about earlier. That's the whole plant. That's the whole 1.6 million divided by the whole labor hours. Now the way to think about it is we're getting a little bit more granular. We're getting more focused. So all we're doing is we're looking at one department at a time. Okay? That's the idea. So department budget divided by department allocation. Department budget divided by department allocation. So fabrication, 1,030,000 divided by 10,000 hours is $103 per labor hour. What about assembly? We allocated 570,000 of overhead from the budget divided by 10,000 hours to get to $57 of labor hour per unit. Okay, so now we have a little bit more data. How are our 10 hours per unit being allocated? Each snowmobile spends 8 hours in the fabrication department and 2 hours in the assembly department to get to the 10 hours per unit for the snowmobile. The riding lawnmower, on the other hand, spends only 2 hours in fabrication and 8 hours in assembly. You can already see where we're going with this, right? We can break it down to the point of allocation for each department and for each unit. So here's how it looks. The snowmobile. spends 8 hours in the fabrication department. We figured out that the production department factory overhead rate for the fabrication department is $103 per direct labor hour. So if a snowmobile spends 8 hours, we multiply that by the $103 per direct labor hour to get to a overhead allocation of $824 from the fabrication department. I'm like, well, we still got 2 more hours. So 2 hours from the assembly department at a rate of $57 per hour is $114. So, of course, you got to add those two together because, remember, 10 hours per unit. So 824 plus 114 gets you to 938 per snowmobile. So total factory overhead per snowmobile is $938 under this method. What about the riding lawnmower? It spends 2 hours in fabrication department. And it spends 8 hours in the assembly department. 2 hours times 103 is 206. 8 hours times 57 is 456. You add the two together to get your 10 hours for the riding lawnmower is $662 per riding lawnmower. Make sense? Any questions so far?
Still got to let it sink in, Professor.
I got you. Okay. I got you. Thank you, Thedrone. I saw your thumbs up. I appreciate that. All right, cool. So just think of it this way. You need to break it down by department. If it spends 8 hours in the fabrication department, and we figured out that the allocation for that department is $103 per hour, 8 times 103, 824. Then you do the same thing for the assembly department. And you do it for both units, the snowmobile unit and the riding lawnmower unit. It's just kind of like breaking it down is what it comes down to. And you're getting granular. So you went from the first one, what we talked about was the single plant-wide method. That was the whole company. But now we're talking about individual departments. When we talk about individual departments, we take the department budget divided by the department budget for hours. Department budget divided by a department budget for hours. That gives us 2 different labor hour overhead costs per unit, per hour. And so, of course, that's going to give us a different overhead cost per product, right? Here's a nice graphical representation of what we just discussed. Fabrication, 103, 103. So fabrication is $103 per hour. Assembly department is $57 per hour. Then you just simply multiply that by the number of hours from each respective department for each respective product. Okay, this next one's a little bit more challenging. Ready? Any questions? Multiple production method. Multiple production department method. Any question? Good? Okay.
So this slide is confusing.
I know, right? I like this one better. This one's a lot easier.
I agree.
I don't know what they were thinking with this one. It's got so many arrows. Yeah.
Wrong direction. I feel like a Spider-Man meme.
Me too. This one's like a web for sure. Yeah, this one's much more clean. Okay. Let's jump into this one. This concept gets a little bit confusing for some people. So if you have a question as we talk about the distortion of product costs, make sure you ask your question. I'm sure you're not the only one with that question. Okay. Distortion costs, what are they? Distortion costs is the difference between the methods. So Andre asked earlier, you asked the question, Can a company use all three to fine-tune the bottom line? The short answer is no. You can't use all three at the same time, but you can compare the different methods through this process we call distortion cost. Distortion cost. Distortion cost represents the difference between the individual methods. We talked about earlier in our example, the single plant-wide method per unit is $800 using the single plant-wide method. We later discussed how we can better allocate overhead using the multiple production department method. We find that for snowmobiles it's $938, for riding lawnmowers it's $662. You're like, oh, that's interesting, because I see that it's actually higher for snowmobiles than the single plant-wide method, and it's lower for riding lawnmowers. That's interesting. Well, it's because the snowmobile spends more time in metal fabrication and less time in assembly, and the riding lawnmower spends more time in assembly and less time in metal fabrication. That's why there's a difference between the single plant-wide method and the multiple production. Because with multiple production department method, what we're doing is we're getting granular. We're looking at each department. And so when we add those two departments together, we see that there's a difference from the single plant-wide method. The difference is actually negative for snowmobiles. We know that it's more expensive that's not the right word. It's a higher rate for the multiple production department method for snowmobiles than it is the single plant-wide rate. But the opposite is true for the riding lawnmowers, also a difference of $138. We see that it's a lower rate for the riding lawnmowers in the multiple production department method than it is in the single plant-wide. This is because, they're different products, right? And so you need to treat them as different products. That's why the multiple production department method is better, in my opinion, than the single plant-wide rate because it's more focused. It gives you more attention for allocating the overhead, right? And so that's the difference. That's the difference between the two. So that's where distortion costs come into play. The distortion cost is at $138. Go ahead, Andre.
So basically what distortion costs is what I'm understanding is that we take the total of our three methods or two methods in this particular slide, single plant-wide and multiple production, and then we basically subtract them to get the difference between the two.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
And fine-tune that to our bottom line.
Yes, 100% correct. That's exactly right. Yes, I couldn't agree more. That you said it perfectly. That is the exact purpose of distortion of product cost. Is it tells us the difference between the two or three methods, as we'll see here in a little bit, and it tells us which method is the best for that particular product. So yeah, very good, very good. We see with snowmobiles, the allocation is enough cost, and it's under $138 over for the riding lawnmowers. So basically, what this tells us, if I were to use a single plant-wide method, I would be overcosting my lawnmower by $138. Right? I'm basically applying too much overhead to the riding lawnmower and not enough to the snowmobile. And so that's why the multiple production rate method works better for this company.
Professor, I'm a little confused now because we're trying to figure out which one works the best. And we were saying how we're trying to figure out which one. Okay, so I guess my confusion is that I'm seeing the same number for the differences.
Yep.
And I'm trying to figure out, okay, well now which one is the best, even though they both are saying the same number.
Right. Yeah. So the number's going to be the same. The difference is the method of allocation, right? And so if we look at it this way, Andre, and let's break it down together, okay? So everyone understands it. So the way it works is I'm looking at the single plant-wide rate method, $800. Then I'm looking at the multiple production rate department method, $938. What that tells me is I underapplied my factory overhead dollars by 138. I underapplied it. I did not allocate enough factory overhead for the snowmobiles. In terms of the riding lawn, exactly, that's why it's negative. And in terms of the riding lawnmower, single plant-wide rate, I said, each unit's going to be $800 for overhead. When in reality, we find out it's $662. So I over-applied the overhead by $138 for the riding lawnmowers. Does it make more sense?
It makes more sense now that I understand the parentheticals mean negative. Now I see the difference of seeing which one is the higher and more cost effective.
Got you. Wonderful. Great.
Thank you for clarifying that up.
No, I appreciate the question. It's really helpful because I'm sure you're not the only one that had that question. So thank you. Thank you for asking. Okay, and so that's basically what this slide tells us is for the snowmobile, we did not apply enough factory overhead. And for the riding lawnmower, we applied too much. And that's why it's important to look at these multiple methods side by side to understand which method is best for the company to utilize when it comes to applying factory overhead to the individual products that it sells. Okay, so after we figured out the differences for our two departments, we can figure out which method is the best. Single plant wide is going to be over under, and multiple department is going to be more accurate for each type of product. Okay, couple of things to consider with this method. This method, the cost can also be distorted in a couple of different ways. Planning, design, quality. These are differences in the production department factory overhead rates. Planning, is I'm planning to create this snowmobile. Okay, I'm planning to create this snowmobile or this number of snowmobiles. The design is the physical design of the snowmobile. It tells me how well it's designed, and if I need to change it later on to a new design. And then quality, we're looking at how long does it last? How can I disassemble it and reassemble it? How many times can I do that? And it be easy or follow the same process. We call disassembly and reassembly quality control. That's what quality control means from a business perspective. Quality control means, can I disassemble something and reassemble it using the same process and the same methods? If the answer is yes, then we know that it has high quality control metrics. If the answer is no, then we know that something is wrong in the design and planning processes. And I look at these in comparison to all of my products and the differences among the products in the ratios of the allocation using a base within across different departments. We'll talk more about this stuff, but I just want you to kind of get a better understanding of how distortion costs are associated with different products. So let's talk about it. And Here's the fun formulas. So remember, when we talked about single plant-wide method, we talked about taking the total annual budget for overhead divided by the total budget for the number of hours of labor hours. That gave us the single plant-wide rate method. Using the multiple departments, we took the department budget for overhead divided by the department budget for the number of hours. Okay. We know that there's two different departments in our example. We have the fabrication department and the assembly department. Fabrication department, that's the metal fabrication. Assembly is putting it all together. So we know that the number of hours for each department is going to be different for each type of unit. So we need to figure out the ratios for each department. These ratios are called the ratio of allocation base usage. Basically, what this tells us is how effective I'm using my hours, my labor hours. So for our company, fabrication department rate is 103, assembly rate $57 per hour. We know that for the snowmobiles, it takes 8 hours in fabrication, 2 hours for riding lawnmowers. Assembly, it's 2 hours for snowmobiles, 8 hours for riding lawnmowers. So to get the rate, all we do is we take the direct labor hours for product A, in this case snowmobiles. We divide that by the labor hours for product B, in this case riding lawnmowers, to get us the ratio of allocation for each department. So it takes us 8 hours to create one snowmobile in the fabrication department. It takes us 2 hours to create one riding lawnmower in the fabrication department. 8 divided by 2 gives us the ratio for the allocation base for the fabrication department. In this case, it's 4-to-1. A 4-to-1 ratio, a 4-to-1 ratio is good. It tells us that we are effective at utilizing our hours in the fabrication department. We do the same thing, same process for the assembly department and for every other department that the company has. In our example, product A, the snowmobiles, we use 2 hours in the assembly department. And for riding lawnmowers, it's 8 hours. So 2 divided by 8. In this case, it gives us a ratio of 1-to-4. A 1-to-4 ratio tells us that we're utilizing 1 every 4 hours in the assembly department. It's okay. It's not as effective as the fabrication department. That's just my perspective, okay? But these ratios are helpful for managers to help us to identify how well we're utilizing our hours in each department. Conditions for fabrication and assembly. We know that the departments are different because we use a different number of hours for each product. So we got $103 for fabrication, $57 for labor. And we simply apply those amounts to the hours utilized for each product within the department. For the snowmobiles, it's 8 hours of labor in the fabrication department, so 103 times 8. For the riding lawnmowers, it's 2 hours, so 2 times 103. And then in the fabrication department, 2 hours for the snowmobile, 8 hours for the riding lawnmower. That's how these ratios are computed. It's just a graphical representation of the previous slide and what we already talked about. Again, it's not as clear as the nice chart that we saw. Questions on distortion costs? It makes sense, right? Kind of, sort of, mostly. Andre?
It makes more sense, yeah. Is it possible to attach this slide to the PowerPoint? Because I kind of like this slide.
Yeah, you can. So, Andre, thanks for asking the question. So, if you go into the classroom and you click on week 4, they're right there for you. So you can go ahead and download them and play with them, watch them, whatever. But yeah, so Andre, great question. So all of you are aware, within each week, for each discussion that we have, the PowerPoint slides are there. So feel free to download them and customize them to the way that you like. And Andre, I'm glad that you brought this up, because it's really good for you to use these PowerPoints to help you study for exams, to help you to better understand concepts, and you feel free to take notes on them and all that good stuff. Some of you, including myself, I'm a visual learner. I like having something tangible like a PowerPoint, and I can make notes. So please feel free to do that. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And then we'll talk about the discussion for this week as soon as we finish up our presentation. But thank you. Absolutely. Okay. The moment we've all been waiting for, we're here. Before I get here, any questions at all on distortion costing before we get into activity-based costing, which is the majority of our discussion for tonight?
No question.
Great. Thanks, Keandre. Appreciate it. I got you, Andre. I'll figure out what happened. It should be there, but if it's not, I'll get it to you.
Professor.
My pleasure. Okay, let's jump in on it. Activity-based costing. Oh yeah. Okay. Activity-based costing is an alternative approach to allocating factory overhead. It's different than the previous two that we discussed. Activities, what are they? Activities are the type of work, actions, type of work or actions involved in the manufacturing process. Example, an activity might be machine hours. An activity might be staining wood. An activity might be assembly line. I don't know. There's so many different activities or type of work, right? So think of activity as a type of work or an action. That's what an activity is. So activity-based costing. We utilize activity-based costing primarily in the budgeting process. It helps us to allocate activities into these things we call activity cost pools. When you hear the word pool, don't think swimming pool. That's not the pool. A pool in accounting is where we group similar costs together. A pool in accounting is when we group similar costs together. Okay? Similar costs might be labor hours in the assembly department. Those are similar costs. So we group them together in this thing called a cost pool. Cost pools also include things like machine usage, how many hours the machine is running. The number of inspections. When you hear the word inspection, I want you to think quality control inspection. An inspection involves disassembling a finished good and then reassembling it. That is an inspection. When we talk about manufacturing, that's an inspection. It assures quality control. Moving is a cost pool. Moving involves taking the product from one department to another. You're taking it from this work in process stage to this work in process stage. The earlier example we talked about when we talked about process costing, the example we talked about was ice cream manufacturing. We took it from the mixing department and moved it to the packaging department. Both work in process, right? So that's moving it from one department to another. Production setups. When you hear the word setup in manufacturing, we're talking about setting up the assembly line, okay? We need to recalibrate the machines after each run. A run is a term that we use to create a batch of product, okay? That's a run. So each run requires a new setup. This setup is fine-tuning or what we call recalibrating the machines, making sure they're running optimally, changing the oil on the machines, setting the parameters to the micrometer for the machines, that type of stuff. That's a setup. That's a production setup. You're recalibrating the machines. You're aligning the assembly line properly. Those are production setups. And we also have engineering activities. Engineering activities involves, how do I want to put this? It involves things like creating a new design off of an old design. Example, you went from iPhone 10 to iPhone 11 or whatever. I don't even know what number we're at these days. It's probably like 50 something. So you went from iPhone 10 to iPhone 11. That is an engineering activity. What happened was the company made modifications to the existing design to create a new product. That's an engineering activity. Another example would be making modifications to an existing product to create a new product, or creating a new product entirely. We also call this R&D, research and development. Assembling chainsaws. It can be. If we're creating new chains. If we're creating a new chain. Oh, you're talking about the production setup, Andre? Your chainsaw example?
Yeah, that example was back for when we was talking about like labor and the activity-based counting.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good example. A chainsaw would be for production setup because it has to be recalibrated after so many uses, right? Yep, and then engineering activities is like making modifications to existing products. The example I gave, iPhone 10 to iPhone 11, making small modifications. Okay. In contrast, multiple production department factory overhead rates are used. Factory overhead costs are first allocated from the production departments. Basically, all that says is we either use activity-based costing or a different method. The other method is probably going to be multiple production, which we talked about earlier. Let's compare the two. Okay. Earlier, we talked about multiple production departments. Our example of Ruiz company who manufactures snowmobiles and riding lawnmowers, we had two departments. We had the assembly department and the fabrication department. Okay, and we talked all about that. In activity-based costing, we no longer have departments. We have activities. So an activity would be assembling the engine. An activity would be welding the body. An activity would be adding oil to the engine. An activity would be whatever else you could think of, right? These are activities. So different activities have different activity rates. It's the same idea. It's the same idea, right? It's just we're getting more granular. We're getting more focused. That's what activity-based costing is all about. And we add up all of these different activities and their activity rates to get to the product cost. Plus, obviously, your direct labor and your direct materials. So, let's jump into some activities and talk about it. So, core activities. These are what the company does primarily as activities. It's different than departments. These are activities. They're similar. Okay. Think of fabrication as an activity, not as a department. Fabrication means we're welding the body of the snowmobile or the riding lawnmower. Assembly as an activity is putting together the finished product, right? So our core activities, we budgeted $600,000 to our core activities of our overhead. We budgeted $600,000 out of our $1.6 million original budget. $1.6 million is our annual budget. We budgeted $600,000 of that 1.6 to our core activities, fabrication and assembly. Now, there are what I call sub-activities or related activities that come from our core activities. What do I mean? In order to fabricate or assemble something, we also need to do other things. We need to set up our assembly lines for each activity. We need to inspect the finished goods that come out of those activities. We need to change our engineering design based off of those activities. So that's why it says derived from fabrication and assembly activities. We have setup activities, quality control inspection activities, and engineering change activities. An engineering change is what we call R&D, research and development, that results in changes in designs. That's why you see what they call new models, right? Think of a car, for example. Oh, I see you got the 2021 model of this particular car, which is slightly different than the 2019 model or whatever. I don't know. But there's slight changes. Those changes are called engineering changes. They're modifications to the original design. And so our company, we allocated $1 million of our total $1.6 million budget for overhead to set up activities, quality control inspections, and engineering changes. For the core activities, we budgeted $530,000 for fabrication and $70,000 for assembly. For our related activities, we budgeted $480,000 for setup activity, $312,000 for quality control inspections, and $280,000 for engineering changes. We're good so far, right? You understand what an activity is now and how it corresponds?
An activity sounds, in my opinion, sounds like it's the amount of money we've allocated to that particular activity. And then after that, we add each activity up to get to our final core.
Yes, exactly right. Very good, Andre. Exactly right. Very, very good. Okay, awesome. You got the right idea. So now let's put it in the cost. Okay, so we budgeted our activities. We know how much we plan on spending for each activity. Fabrication, $530. Assembly, $70. Setups, $480. Quality control, $312. Engineering, $280. You add all those up, we get our budget, $1.6 million. Okay. Each activity has its own rate. has its own rate. So the budget activity costs are assigned to each activity. We call these activity rates. The activity rate, we take the budgeted activity cost and we divide by the total activity-based usage. Activity-based usage. The word activity-based is the same as allocation base that we learned from the other methods, right? But the activity usage base is the number of hours, the dollar amount, it's whatever selected for that base, right? So let's look at it from our example. We expect we're going to produce 1,000 snowmobiles and 1,000 riding lawnmowers this year. We expect that we're going to need to set up our assembly line 100 different times throughout the year for the snowmobiles and 20 different times for the riding lawnmowers. We also expect we're going to complete 100 inspections, quality control inspections, that's breaking it down and reassembling it, 100 times for the snowmobiles throughout the year, and 4 times for our riding lawnmowers. We also expect that we will modify the design of our snowmobiles 12 different times throughout the year. Modify, small changes. And then we'll also modify our design 4 times a year for the riding lawnmowers. Let's budget it out. We know it takes 8 hours of fabrication for our snowmobiles and 2 hours of assembly for our snowmobiles. We expect to make 1,000 units of snowmobiles. 1,000 times 8 is 8,000. 1,000 times 2 is 2,000. That's 10,000 hours that we expect that we're going to use for what? For our snowmobiles. And riding lawnmowers, fabrication 2 hours. We're going to make 1,000 riding lawnmowers. So 2 times 1,000 is 2,000. Then we have to assemble those lawnmowers. 8 hours of assembly per unit times 1,000 units, that's 8,000. 8 plus 2 is 10. 10,000 hours for the lawnmowers. Okay. Now, here we go. 10,000 hours in fabrication, 10,000 hours in assembly. Total. 8,000 for the snowmobile, 2,000 for the riding lawnmower and fabrication, 2,000 for the snowmobile, 8,000 for the lawnmower and assembly. We said that we will have to complete 100 setups for the snowmobiles and 20 setups for the riding lawnmowers for a total of 120 setups. We also said we're going to complete 100 quality control inspections for the snowmobile line and 4 quality control inspections for the riding lawnmowers for a total of 104 inspections. And engineering changes, we said we're going to do 12 engineering changes for the snowmobile throughout the year and 4 for the riding lawnmower to give us a total of 16 total engineering changes for the year. Now remember, we budgeted a dollar amount for each activity. Fabrication, we budgeted $530,000. We said we're going to use 10,000 total direct labor hours in fabrication. That's $53 per direct labor hour. 530,000 divided by 10,000. For assembly, we budgeted $70,000. We said we're going to use 10,000 hours for assembly. That gives us the $7 per unit. For setup, we budgeted $480,000. We said we're going to complete a total of 120 setups. So $480,000 divided by 120 is $4,000 per setup. That's about right. That sounds pretty accurate. Quality control. We budgeted $312,000 for quality control. We're going to do 104 inspections. That gives us a $3,000 cost per inspection. Engineering changes, we budgeted $208,000. We said we're going to do 16 total engineering changes. That gives us a $13,000 per engineering change. Good so far? Okay. Now we got to allocate that cost. We figured out the activity rate per the activity rate per activity. The activity rate per activity. To figure out the activity rate per activity, you take the budgeted activity cost divided by total activity base usage. Now, let's figure out the activity overhead allocation. Overhead costs for each activity rate are allocated to a product using this formula. Activity-based usage times the activity rate. Activity-based usage times the activity rate. Activity-based usage times activity rate. That gives us the total activity overhead allocation. Then what we do is we estimate the total factory overhead for a single product by taking the sum of the product's individual activity allocations. So Andre, just like you said earlier, you add up each allocation cost and apply it to each unit. So how do we do that? We take the total factory overhead cost. I guess there's a couple things we do, right? The first thing we do is we take the total factory overhead cost, 1.6 million in our example, divided by the total units of estimated production. Well, I think we said we're going to, so it's 2,000, right? Because we're 1,000 lawnmowers and 1,000 snowmobiles. But of course, we're going to do that for each unit, right? So, okay, so here's how it looks. For the snowmobiles, fabrication, 8,000 hours, $53 per hour. That's $424,000. Assembly, 2,000 hours, $7 per hour, $14,000. Setups, 100 setups for the snowmobiles, $4,000 per setup. Gets us a $400,000. Inspections, 100 of them. At $3,000 per inspection, that's $300,000. Engineering changes, 12 at $13,000 a piece is $156,000. You add up all of those activity costs, 424 plus 14 plus 400 plus 300 plus 156 equals $1,294,000. We divide that by the estimated units of production. We said we're going to make 1,000 snowmobiles and 1,000 riding lawnmowers. So 1,294,000 divided by 1,000 equals $1,294 per unit of factory overhead. That means we apply $1,294 of overhead to each snowmobile. And then, of course, you add in your direct labor, direct materials to get the total cost, right? We do the same process for the riding lawnmowers. Fabrication, 2,000 hours times $53 per hour. 8,000 hours for assembly times $7 per hour. 20 setups times $4,000 per setup. 4 inspections times $3,000 per inspection. 4 engineering changes times $13,000 per engineering change. You get all those costs 106,000, 56, 80, 12, 52. You add them all up. Total factory overhead cost for the lawnmowers is 306,000. You divide by 1,000 lawnmowers we expect to create in a year. Gets us to $306 of factory overhead per riding lawnmower. Andre, makes sense?
Yes, it's breaking down. I'm sinking it in.
Cool, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. John V, are we good?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yep. I'm
Wonderful.
trying to get it.
I got you. Okay. Yeah. I just want to make sure, it's important that you all get the concepts down. It's, I appreciate you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
My pleasure, Andre. Okay. So that breaks it down by activity. Fabrication activity, we budgeted $530,000 at $53 per hour. Assembly, we budgeted $70,000, $7 per hour. Setups, we budgeted $480,000. It's $4,000 per setup. Quality control, we budgeted $312,000, $3,000 per inspection. $208,000 budgeted to engineering. That's $13,000 per engineering change order. And we got to $1,294 per snowmobile and $306 per riding lawnmower. And just like you said before, Andre, this slide's a little bit more confusing. I prefer this one.
The total opposite.
Exactly. Sometimes these graphical representations are a little confusing, but yeah. And so just like this class, as you know, is managerial accounting. Managerial accounting, we generate reports to help us to better understand our costs. And this report here compares the three methods. Factory overhead cost per unit using the three allocation cost methods. We have the single plant-wide rate, which we talked about. We have the multiple production rate, multiple department production rate, which we talked about. And we also talked about activity-based costing. Now, what do we do from here? We look at the differences, also known as the distortion costs. The distortion cost tells me which method is the most effective for my business. Single plant-wide rate, it's very simple. You take the total factory overhead divided by the number of total hours that we expect to use. Multiple production department rate, we're taking the rate from each department and allocating it to the single units. And for activity-based costing, we're taking each activity, adding those up, and applying it to each unit, right? And so what we see in front of us is this. $800 single plant-wide rate. For multiple production department rates, $938, $662. We're over 138 and under by 138. Then we get down to activity-based costing, and it's very, very specific, okay? Snowmobiles, $1,294 per unit and $306 per unit for the riding lawnmowers. Now, the question I pose to you is, if your company makes more than one item, more than one product, that are significantly different, like snowmobiles and riding lawnmowers, those are very different. Which of these three methods are probably going to be the most accurate? And the short answer to that is going to be activity-based costing, because it's very specific to each activity. So, what we just saw, single plant-wide rate, we're over or under using the multiple department by $138. If we compare the single plant-wide rate to activity-based costing, which is what we're doing on this slide, our snowmobiles are understated or underapplied factory overhead by $494. Our riding lawnmowers are overapplied by $494. If we were to mistakenly overapply factory overhead by $494 and we increase sales, resulting in increased sales, we would not expand production. If we underapplied factory overhead by $494, we would decrease sales and we would stop production. Activity-based costing, it's more accurate to price your products, and it results in better pricing decisions and more exact cost. That's why factory overhead's the best. Yeah, it's very exact. Okay, questions? Activity-based costing. No questions? Activity-based costing? Sinking in, making sense, all that good stuff?
None of it makes sense, but it's always well. I'm still at work though.
Well, Lakeisha, I am sure it'll make more sense when you watch the video again.
It will. It will.
And you just keep in mind, if you ever have a question, you could call me, you can email me, we can set up some office hours, all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's fine. Like, I just see this right here. I will pay people for. I'm not about to sit here and deal with that. That's why it's people out there call accountants I will pay them for peace.
That's true. Well, just be careful, because some accountants they charge a lot, and
Lakeisha can call me after I graduate. I'm available.
That's
Oh,
right.
don't worry. Oh, don't run the numbers in the chat, sis. Run the numbers in the chat. Don't worry.
You guys are great. I love you. Fantastic. Okay, very cool. Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, activity-based costing, selling administrative expenses. As you know, selling administrative expenses get expensed out on the income statement. They apply for the generally accepted accounting principles. The only, when it comes to decision-making for selling administrative expenses, we typically expense them out. But in some cases, as you know, depending on the use of the single income statement or the multi-step income statement, it'll either be identified as being an expense or part of cost of goods. And you probably remember that, or hopefully remember that from financial accounting. In some cases, companies will identify their selling administrative expenses differently, depending on the activities associated with them or by the way that they expense them out. What do I mean? Selling administrative expenses are activities. There are activities associated with them. So you could identify selling administrative expenses based off of the activity base, just like we talked about for the manufacturing of products. Works very similar. And that's kind of what this tells us. It just helps us to identify selling administrative expenses by activity. So they're allocated by activity on the basis of sales volume. Sales volume, it would be your, what do I call that? Would be your base. The number of sales would be your base, and the budget for selling administrative expenses would be the top. Exactly. So here's how that looks. The company budgeted $150,000 for warranties, which is a part of your selling and administrative expenses. Warranties. Warranties, as you know, or as you hopefully know, are if there's like a defect in a product that you purchased, it might be covered under warranty. Warranty basically is a protection for customers. If there's a defect or something goes wrong with their product, it might be covered under warranty. And so the companies will budget that in their expenses, that there's going to be a certain amount that will be claimed. So the company budgeted $150,000 for warranties that will be claimed. We estimate that a total of 100 warranties will be claimed during the year. So what's the activity rate? We take the budgeted activity cost, in this case warranty claims, 150,000, divided by the total activity-based usage. That's the number of claims we expect will be used. In this case, 100. So 150,000 divided by 100 is $1,500 per warranty claim. It's the same exact concept that we use to apply activity-based costing to the activities in the manufacturing process. The only difference now is we're applying it to selling and administrative expenses. It's the same exact formula, same exact concept. Really, you could do this to a lot of different things, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds. Okay. What about service businesses? Can we use activity-based costing in service businesses? The answer is yes. It's just like we talked about in process-based costing. We talked about using process-based costing in service businesses. An example of a service business would be a lawyer, a dentist, an accountant, somebody who charges by the hour, right? Those are a barber shop. Those are all service businesses, right? And so we can use the same concept of activity-based costing and apply it to service businesses. How do we do that? So in this example is a hospital. A hospital is a service. I like to think it's a service, not a product. A hospital is a service. The service that the hospital provides to you is healthcare services. So in our example, the hospital, we are going to go through the process. Andre, good question. Andre asked, can we use activity-based costing for our own personal uses or personal finance? It depends. It depends. Why do I say it depends? You can probably use it if you have different methods of allocating the overhead. So an example would be your household budget. If you have multiple line items on your household budget and they're measured by different weights, like for example, number of hours used, number of days in the month, and you're looking to get it down to the finite cost, then yeah, you probably could. But I don't think I would do that. It gets very complex in that area. Good question. Okay, so for our hospital, go ahead.
I was saying thank you.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. So for our hospital, a hospital is a service business. Our base is our patients, a number of patients. Okay. Step 1, identify the activity. Step 2, determine the activity rate for each activity. Step 3, allocate the overhead costs to the patients based on the activity-based usage. Our hospital identified the following activities: admissions, radiology testing, the operating room, pathology testing, dietary and laundry. Dietary is that they deliver the food to you when you stay overnight. Yeah. And then laundry is obvious. They're taking care of the patient gowns and the linens, and it's a hospital. Okay. So here's the allocation. The hospital allocates $180 per admission. Okay. $320 per radiology image. $200 per hour for the operating room use. $120 per specimen for pathology. And $150 per day per patient for dietary and laundry. We allocate based off of the usage, right? Activity-based costing. So here's the example of imaging or radiology. So radiology imaging, we assume that the budgeted cost for radiology is $960,000 per year, and the radiology department expects to produce 3,000 images for the year. So just like before, you take the total budget, in our example, 960,000, divided by the number of images, number of units that are expected. In this case, images. 960,000 divided by 3,000 images. That gives us an activity-based rate of $320 per image. And you'd apply that same concept for each activity, right? So how do we allocate it to our patient? It's based off of the number of images or the number of days or whatever it is that the patient uses times the rate, the activity rate. So here's our patient. Our patient was admitted. That's one admission. The patient utilized 2 images from radiology. The patient was in the operating room for 4 hours. The patient provided 1 specimen for pathology testing. And the patient was with us for 7 days. We allocated a total overhead cost for that patient of $2,790. How did we get there, you might ask? Admission was $180. Imaging was $320 per image, 2 images at $640. Operating room, the patient was in the operating room for 4 hours at $200 per hour. That's $800. 1 specimen cost is $120. Patient was in the hospital for 7 days for dietary and laundry. That's $150 per day. That's $1,050. So the total overhead for this patient, total factory overhead, the total hospital overhead for this patient was $2,790. We got that by adding up all of the individual units. Make sense? That's how it works for a service business. It's the same concept. We're good? So we're almost done. Great. Thank you so much, Angela. Yeah, we're almost done. So you take your patient activity costs and your direct costs, get to your related revenue to get your patient profitability report. You know that hospitals are very profitable, right? Okay, that's why they exist. That's why there's a lot of them. Okay, so the way it works, your patient activity costs, that's your activity-based costs, so we just talked about. Then you have your direct costs. Think direct labor, direct materials. Direct, so it'll be drug supplies is your direct materials, all right? And then, of course, the supplies that the hospital is using. Related revenues. Revenue is the difference between what the hospital bills to the insurance company and the other revenues that are collected directly from the patients, right? Revenue minus your cost of goods. In this case, your direct labor, direct materials, patient overhead gets to your patient profitability. This is how it works. This is how it works in the real world, as we say. Hospital has multiple patients. We do the same thing for each patient. Yeah. Revenue. That's how much we bill the insurance company. Minus your patient costs, drug supply expense, admission, radiology, operating room, pathology, dietary and laundry, total patient cost. Revenue minus total patient costs equals operating income for that patient. Yeah, makes sense. Great. I don't know what happened with this patient. It looks like the hospital lost money. I don't know how that happened. Probably didn't bill enough. Okay, 4 more slides and then we're done.
That means the patient won.
Yes, that means the patient won. Yeah, it rarely happens, but I guess this patient got very lucky.
Absolutely.
So funny. It's so true. Okay, activity-based costing can be used to improve the cost of a product. If we look at each individual cost of a product using activity-based costing, we can better identify how much we should sell that product for. And it also helps us to improve the, the process for each product. We look at things like the amount of labor for each activity. And the management will look at ways we can reduce labor expenses for each activity. Streamlining, we call it. I guess. Okay, so looking at our earlier example, we have assembly, setup, production control, materials control, moving, and testing. We take the activity-based usage and we multiply that by the activity rate per hour to get us a total activity cost per activity. Add all those up. The idea here, by looking at these types of costs are to help us to eliminate some costs or to reduce some costs to be more efficient. Efficiency is key. Activity cost reduction can be accomplished by improving operations, moving things around, eliminating waste, changing the classification of employees by affecting their activity rate, things like that. The assumption is that we continuously improve using this data. That's the idea behind it. And so from this example, we're looking at setup costs and moving costs and how can we reduce those and we can do that by affecting the activity-based usage, by streamlining things, improving it. Go ahead, Andre.
Hey, Professor.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of thinking here and just putting things together.
Sure.
So if I was to own a home or rent an apartment, the activity-based cost would be kind of like the amount of water I'm using or the amount of gas I'm using,
Yeah,
or
right.
the amount of electricity that I'm using within that home or apartment.
That's
Is
right.
that where the connection's going a little bit?
Yeah, if you're looking to do it from a personal perspective, yeah. It would be like things like water usage, and then you divide it by the number of hours in a day or something like that, and that would give you your cost of running the water per hour for that day, right? Yeah, you can totally do stuff like that. That's totally reasonable. I mean, I don't know if I would personally go that far because, but you could if you want to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, absolutely. Yep. Fun stuff. Okay. We made it. Yay. See, that wasn't that bad. I mean, we got Lakeisha at work and she's like, yeah, that wasn't that bad, but, I could totally watch this again later and I could, get those PowerPoints and make some awesome notes. I'm just, thinking out loud, Lakeisha, what do you think?
No, you're right. I mean, I do, like, if I don't get it, I'll go back and watch it. And that's the only way how I can get, my classwork done.
Sure, yeah.
It gets done. It just ain't, I think it's when you come from work and then you sit at work all day talking to people and then you trying to listen to infrastructure for like a whole hour, it doesn't click.
I feel you. I do. I totally feel you on that. Yeah, no doubt. Great. Any questions? Any questions at all? Activity-based costing. And then I'll talk to you about the assignment real quick, which this week is a discussion board. But I got to make sure that you all understand exactly what I'm looking from you on the discussion forum. Because let me tell you, in my other class, because right now I'm also teaching Accounting 201, in my other class, some of them didn't participate. Actually, a lot of them didn't. And that's not good because you got to remember, every assignment is worth 5% of your total grade. Total grade, yes? So we need to make sure that we're clear on what I'm looking for from you in the discussion. So questions on activity-based costing before we talk about the assignment? We okay?
Yeah. I'm ready for you to talk about the assignment now.
Oh, great. Okay. Wonderful. All
Can
right.
we put it in perspective, like a little
Yes.
example?
Yes. And that's what we're going to do right now.
Wait a minute, Professor. Now, are you talking about my class I came out of, or the one that you're doing now?
I want to do it right now.
No. I'm talking about the session I just came from.
Session you just came
401.
from.
I'll talk off after class.
Okay. We'll talk about it, Angela. We'll talk about it. Okay. What do we have going on this week? We have a Chapter 18 discussion board. Okay. Discussion boards. Let's talk about them. Discussion boards. There are a total of, I think it was 3, right? Discussion boards total for our class. Is it 4? I forget. I forget already. Let's look. Let's look. I get confused sometimes. You know how I get. So many things going on. Discussion boards. There are a total of 4 discussion boards throughout our time together this semester. We're at our first one, our first real one. Chapter 18 discussion board. I don't count introductions as a real discussion. I mean, yes, it's a real discussion, and I really appreciate all of you participating in that because it helps us to get to know each other. Well, let's talk about Chapter 18 discussion board. Now, to get to it, you can either access it through the discussion board or you can simply go in the preferred way. I want you to get to it as you go into the classroom, come down to module 1, come down to week 4, and access it that way. Why that way? Because there's the PowerPoints right there as well. It's just nice and easy. I try to do everything through that content area. That's the idea. Make it easy for yourself, including the homework. Everything right through that content area. Okay, so Chapter 18 discussion. There's a question and then some instructions. The question: when might activity-based costing be preferred over using a relative amount of product sales and allocating selling and administrative expenses to products? Ooh, that's a mouthful. Okay. So in this discussion, here's how it works. You're going to write a couple of paragraphs, about 150 words per paragraph. Try it, please. Make sure you write full paragraphs. Don't give me bullets. Don't give me numbers. Don't give me, fragmented sentences. Don't type it on your phone. Use spell check. Please use spell check. You guys are killing me sometimes. Use spell check. Okay. Write up your response. Maybe do it in Microsoft Word before, so that way it checks your grammar and spelling nice and easy. I'm expecting a couple of paragraphs, about 150 words or so. Where do you get this information? You might be asking. Your textbook is a great resource. You can use the internet, for other resources. And you're like, oh, I want to consult this website for, this information in addition to my textbook. That's totally fine. Absolutely. I encourage it, in fact. So you're going to write up a couple of paragraphs in your response. So you'll come in here and you'll go type a response and you'll write up your paragraph. Yeah. And then you click respond and it posts it. Yeah. That's step one. And please try to do that by Thursday night. This Thursday night, try to make sure you get your original response in. Here's why. In addition to getting your original response in, I'm looking for you to respond to 2 of your classmates. And I'm not looking for a good job, that's a nice post, blah, blah, blah. That stuff ain't going to work. You need to respond to your classmates and be very thoughtful in your response. What do I mean? Ask engaging questions. Write a full paragraph for each response. Full paragraph, guess what? 3 sentences? That is not a full paragraph. That may have been a full paragraph when you were, I don't know, in 8th grade or whatever, but that is not a full paragraph when you're in college or at the university. Full paragraph, we're talking 8 sentences. That's a full paragraph, 8 to 10 sentences. So be thoughtful in your responses and make sure you respond to 2 people. Oh, and by the way, it should all be done on time. So try to get your first response in by Thursday night. Then get your 2 responses to your classmates in by Sunday night. Now, if you're like, Dr. B, how are you going to grade me on this? I love when you ask that question because you already know there's a rubric. So there's this one here that says rubric, yeah? Here's the rubric. Here's the rubric. And here's how it looks. Now, you see the first one there, comprehension. It's worth 40%. We got excellent, satisfactory, needs improvement, and not evident. Please make sure you're not in the not evident column. Make sure you're in the excellent column. How do I get the excellent column? Develops an initial post with organized, clear point of view, using an idea, using rich and significant detail. What do I mean by rich and significant detail? You're using examples from your textbook. You're using examples from other websites that you found. And you're citing them, and you're using references and all that good stuff. That's excellent. That's excellent. I'm looking for full paragraphs. I'm looking for citations and references, if you can. I prefer that you can. Please try, at least try to do it. Yeah, it'll make your post more thorough, more full. So that's comprehension. Timeliness, on time. Oh, it's very easy to be on time. Just original post by Thursday night, 2 responses by Sunday night. That's on time. As you can see, the later you get, the less points you're going to get. Make sure it's on time. Engagement. If you respond to 2 or more of your classmates using full paragraphs and thoughtful and it's very clear with great detail, engagement, that'll be 100%. Look at that. It's 30% of the grade for this assignment. So, yes, I'm looking. And if you just give a that's nice type of response, a couple of words, that's going to be a 0. Yeah, and I'll tell you it's a 0. Because it says provides response that posts are generic with little explanation or detail. That's a 0. So please make sure you respond to 2 of your classmates with great detail. Yes? And then writing mechanics. Make sure you use spelling, grammar, spell check, all that good stuff. Make sure it's clear punctuation, no errors in your citations and references. I'm not going to hit you hard if you mess up citations or references, but I just want you to understand how they work and why they work. You need to give credit for where you found information from. Very important that you do that. It's not just academics. It's also legal, right? You have to make sure that you do things the right way. Does it make sense? Are we clear on this? How this works?
Okay, so Professor B, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
What if I've already responded? I'm gonna say Lakeisha. What if I, gave her a good response, yada yada yada? What if I don't already said what I needed to say to her in her response? Well, to her response or whatever. and then I come up empty responding to maybe Andre. I mean, me personally, I can correspond with anyone in person, but this is a challenge for me all the time to
Sure.
do it like this. So my question to you, what if I already responded really excellent to Lakeisha, then I may not have that much to say to Andre.
Great. So what I would do in that case, Angela, and this is what I do for the students, right? Typically, when I respond to one of your discussion posts, I would say something like, this is really insightful. Have you considered this? Have you looked at this resource? What's your overall perception on this? How might you apply this to your life? By first, of course, engaging and adding to what they wrote is step one. You say, hey, great post. I also thought about this, which is adding to their post, not something that they already wrote. And then you would also might want to ask them a question by saying, hey, I learned more about this, and I might be able to apply it this way. What do you think? How might you be able to apply this? In other words, what I'm saying is you're adding to what they already wrote, and then you're asking the engaging question. You're asking that thoughtful, open-ended question. And that is a nice response. That's a good response. Does that help to answer your question, Angela?
Yes, sir. I'm gonna try it that way, but again, this is very challenging for me.
Sure.
Period. Throughout any classes,
Sure.
because I can give a conversation in person, but far as me writing and responding like that, it's kind of challenging.
I know.
You want it to be 150 words.
Yeah, ideally. Yep.
But okay, thank you. I'll try.
Give it a shot. That's all you can do is try. I mean,
will.
I'm not going to ding you too hard if it's not 150 words. I'm not counting the words. I mean, the machine is, but I'm not. If what I'm really looking for is substance. I'm looking for, what I mean. That's what I care about is substance. Yeah.
Okay, so now I understand. Thank you.
My pleasure. Very good. Great. Any other comments, questions, concerns? Anything at all? I'm here for you. You guys know that.
No, I
John,
get it. Okay. I don't have no questions though.
okay. All right, John VA, I got you. And if you think of anything, I'm here. Just go ahead and shoot that email, and or call me, email me, whatever you got to do, and we'll get through it. No doubt, we'll get through it. Anything else? Anything at all? We're good.
Did you get my email last night, Ms.
Yeah.
Last night, probably. I'll find it. I'll find it. I'm sorry. It's been a long day for me, so I'll get to you. I promise. Okay. Anything else? Anything at all? Comments, questions, concerns? Okay. Thank you all so much for your hard work throughout this semester, especially the past 4 weeks. I really appreciate everything that you're doing. I strongly encourage all of you to stay on top of it. Don't let anything slip behind. Don't slow down now. Okay, now is the time to hit the gas pedal, not the brake. If you need anything, think of anything, and you have a question, you just let me know, and I'll get back to you. If you run into problems with a textbook, problems with a question on the homework, whatever it is, you let me know. I'll get to you. Other than that, I want you to stay safe. I want you to wash your hands. I want you to do all the right things. And I really appreciate all of you. And I wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Dr. B, and have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Good evening.
Have a good evening, everyone.
You too.
Thank you so much. Take care, y'all.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.